Welcome to my YouTube channel. Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe and tap the bell icon. The crash didn't sound like water meeting wood. It sounded like war. It came out of nowhere. No warning. No time to brace. 1 second, the quiet murmur of waves lapping at the dock filled the air. The next, an explosion of wood splintering, metal groaning, and the shuddering thump of something big hitting something small. Fishermen on the pier stopped mid-throw, the nets hanging slack in their hands. The hum of the town in the distance faded. People looked around, unsure of what they were hearing. Then, the noise came again, louder this time. The sharp sound of wood breaking under immense pressure. People gasped, their eyes glued to the water. Tom saw it before anyone else. A small boat, the kind he'd spent years repairing. His fingers had bled fixing that boat. It wasn't much to look at anymore, but it had carried him through rough seas and hard times. A boat with history. A boat that had survived everything life had thrown its way, right until this moment. It flipped over, throwing up a wall of water, and then it sank beneath the waves. A white yacht, gleaming under the sun, glided past it. The massive thing moved with a grace that mocked the destruction it had just caused. The music from its deck was loud, too loud, punctuated by laughter. The crew on board didn't seem to care. They didn't even notice what had happened. Tom didn't blink. He stood there, frozen in place, watching as his boat, his lifeline, his last connection to the past, was torn apart by the steel hull of the yacht. He felt nothing at first. A numbness settled over him. The cold water on his boots didn't register. The people starting to shout and scramble behind him didn't matter. He just watched. The yacht's wake slapped against the pier, rocking the other boats violently. People on the dock started shouting. A few rushed to grab phones, but nobody dared to step closer to Tom. They watched him, wondering if he would do something. Tom had been around long enough to know that sometimes, in moments like this, nothing needed to be done. The storm had already hit. What was left was to see how long you could stand in the rain. But that boat. It wasn't just any boat. It wasn't an accident. Tom knew it. He'd been a Navy man. He had seen war. He had seen things no one should ever see. He didn't need to guess. He didn't need evidence. He could feel it in his bones, like he had known the storm was coming before it ever hit. That boat, sinking beneath the weight of a sleek, silver yacht, was a message. His instincts were never wrong. A voice called out behind him. "Sir, are you all right?" It was the local officer. A young guy, barely old enough to understand what had just happened. Tom turned slowly. His boots were wet now, his pants soaked, but he didn't feel it. The cold didn't register. "Sir," the officer repeated, stepping closer. Tom's eyes locked onto the officer's face. He hadn't shaved in 2 days, the stubble thick on his jaw. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale from lack of sleep. He hadn't rested since the night before, but nothing could have made him leave. The officer hesitated. "Sir, we'll need to file a report." "Did you see what happened?" Tom didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted back to the wreckage. His boat wasn't just sinking. It was disappearing beneath the surface, and he couldn't do a damn thing about it. "It wasn't an accident," Tom finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer frowned. "What do you mean? You think they did that on purpose?" Tom's gaze hardened. His grip tightened on the railing of the dock. "I know it was on purpose. I've seen enough to know when something isn't a mistake." The officer stood back, clearly unsure. "Sir, it looks like a mishap, just a bad accident. We'll get a crew out here to pull it up." Tom shook his head. "No." His tone was final. The officer seemed to hesitate, his lips moving to say something, but he didn't. He just stepped back, clearly not knowing what to do with this. Tom's eyes flicked back to the yacht. It was already far out now, drifting slowly into the horizon. He felt a strange pull. The water, the wreckage, the distant sound of the yacht's engine fading as it cruised further away, it all felt like a dream. But it wasn't. There was something there. Something hidden. He could feel it in the way the air felt colder now. In the way his heart seemed to race faster, even though nothing had changed. The officer finally cleared his throat. "Well, we'll take your statement later. I'm sure the investigators will have a look at everything." Tom didn't respond. As the officer turned to leave, Tom's hand slid into his coat pocket. He touched the small, cold object wrapped in cloth. He didn't pull it out. He just held it there, fingers pressing into the material, grounding himself to reality. That night, Tom didn't go home. He couldn't. The air was too thick with questions, and there were still too many things he needed to figure out. So, he did what he always did when life seemed too heavy. He sat. He found a bench by the pier, curled up in his jacket, and watched the ocean. The local diner, a few blocks away, stayed open late. People offered him food, tea, even blankets. But Tom didn't touch any of it. He didn't need anything right now. Not food, not warmth. Just the silence of the night, broken only by the occasional creak of a dock or the soft sway of the water. The world around him seemed unaware of what had happened. But he wasn't. By morning, things were different. 5 Navy ships lined the coast. Tom didn't know when they arrived. They hadn't been there when he closed his eyes last night. They were gray, steel behemoths cutting through the morning fog. Locals gathered along the shore. Some filmed on their phones. Others whispered to one another. But no one had answers. No one knew why they were there. Tom stood at the end of the pier, watching as the ships passed. His gaze never wavered from the horizon. Something had changed. He could feel it deep in his gut. And then, from beneath his jacket, Tom's fingers closed around the cloth-wrapped object again. He didn't look at it. He didn't need to. He knew what it was. It wasn't much. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't anything that could save him. But it could destroy everything. It was a key. The key to the mystery. The key to why 5 Navy ships had appeared overnight. And the key to the most dangerous game he would ever play. Tom didn't sleep that night. His eyes stayed fixed on the shadowed horizon, where the Navy ships lingered like silent giants in the fog. They hadn't moved, not even an inch, since dawn. There was something about their stillness that made his skin crawl, something off about the way they silently waited. It wasn't normal. Not for a situation like this. But Tom wasn't one to panic. He'd been in tight spots before. Real ones, the kind where death and chaos were your only companions. He had lived through the kind of hell that would make anyone else break down, but not him. He had learned early to bury the fear deep. Still, tonight was different. Tonight, the ocean felt like an enemy, not a refuge. The fog rolled in thicker with each passing hour, a blanket that smothered the harbor, wrapping everything in an eerie silence. A few voices murmured around him, locals who had stayed up to see what would happen next. The usual crowd at the diner had grown larger too. The owners kept the door open, sending out hot drinks and sandwiches, but Tom didn't go inside. He wasn't hungry. Not for food, not for anything. He couldn't help but think about his boat. It wasn't just a boat, of course. It had been his lifeline. The place where his mind wandered when he couldn't sleep, where he felt close to his late wife, Ellie. They had spent countless hours together on the water before the storm, talking about everything and nothing. She was gone now, taken by that unforgiving storm years ago, but her memory still clung to the boat, to the water. Now it was gone. Crushed beneath the sleek white yacht. No more memories. Just sinking wreckage. As the night wore on, the only thing that kept Tom rooted in place was the small object wrapped in cloth in his jacket pocket. It was a reminder. A hint of something bigger. He didn't know exactly what that something was yet, but he could feel it closing in. Morning came too soon, the fog beginning to lift with the first rays of sun. But the Navy ships remained. Their massive hulls looked almost unnatural, their presence alone making the water seem too still, too quiet. Tom could feel something shifting beneath the surface. He wasn't just fighting to keep his memories intact, there was something darker at play now. The boats, the ships, the yacht, the mystery. It was all connected, and he was caught in the middle of it. He had no idea what they were after, but one thing was certain. This wasn't a random accident. He knew that much. By noon, there was no sign of the yacht. It had vanished, leaving only ripples in its wake. But the ships were still there. 3 of them were anchored in the bay. 2 more patrolled the coastline. No one could get close to them. No one dared. Tom had been approached by a couple of officers earlier that morning, but he had said little. There was nothing more to tell them. He didn't trust them, not yet. They seemed too green, too nervous. If they knew what was happening here, they weren't showing it. Instead, he kept to himself, walking around the small harbor, his eyes scanning the ships. He couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The sun was high in the sky when the first group of Navy men came ashore. They were dressed in full gear, moving like shadows across the beach. They ignored the crowd of onlookers and headed straight for the pier. Tom didn't move. His gaze locked onto them. The way they moved wasn't casual. They were prepared, like they knew something they weren't saying. When they reached the dock, one of the officers approached him directly. Tom recognized him from earlier. He was the young one, the one who had asked if he was okay. But now, he didn't ask. He just stared at Tom for a long moment. "You Tom Winters?" the officer asked, his voice low. "That's right," Tom replied without emotion. His hand stayed firmly pressed against the small object in his pocket. "We need to talk to you," the officer said, glancing back at the others. There were 6 of them in total, all standing a few feet away, watching the water, watching Tom. "About what?" Tom asked, keeping his voice steady. "You saw the yacht hit your boat yesterday," the officer continued, taking another step closer. "You're the only one who's witnessed the incident up close. You need to tell us everything you know." Tom's eyes narrowed. "I've told you everything I know. The yacht hit my boat. It wasn't an accident." He didn't need to say more. The officer had already heard his first statement. The officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Look, we've got bigger things happening here. The ship that hit your boat wasn't just some tourist yacht. It's connected to something much bigger. And we need your help." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with a meaning Tom wasn't ready to accept. Tom's heart raced. He took a step back. "You're telling me that yacht wasn't just some rich guy having a good time?" "No," the officer replied. His voice was almost too calm. "It was military." Tom's eyes flicked over to the ship still anchored in the harbor. The officers stood around him now, closing the gap. "You're telling me the yacht was military?" Tom repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Yeah," the officer said, nodding. "And that's not the worst of it." He lowered his voice even more. "There's something on that yacht, something they're after. We need to find out what it is." Tom didn't speak. He just stared at the officer. Everything around him felt like it was spinning out of control. The Navy wasn't here for some misplaced tourist. They weren't here to apologize. They were here for something far more dangerous. The officer stepped back, glancing at his team. We need you to come with us. Now. Tom's pulse quickened. I'm not going anywhere until I know what this is really about. The officer hesitated for a moment before nodding. Fine. We'll bring you in for questioning. But this isn't over. Not by a long shot. The moment they turned, Tom's mind raced. What could be on that yacht? What was so valuable that it warranted this kind of military involvement? And why had they attacked his boat? He knew that whatever was happening, it was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Tom Winters stood on the edge of the dock, his feet planted firmly on the weathered wood. The sky was an unnerving shade of gray. The air was thick with the salt of the ocean, but the winds felt still, almost as if the world was holding its breath. His mind was racing, his thoughts barely coherent as the realization began to settle in. The Navy wasn't here for a simple investigation into a wreck. There was something more at play, and it was something Tom couldn't quite grasp yet. But he knew one thing: whatever it was dangerous. He had spent most of the day on edge, watching as military personnel scurried around in their dark uniforms, taking control of the harbor like an unseen force. They had ordered the locals to stay back, to clear the area. No one was allowed close to the ships, no one was allowed to question what was happening. Tom had seen this before, on the streets of war-torn cities, in places where governments tried to control information and silence witnesses. He had a gut feeling that the crash, the yacht, and the mysterious military presence weren't mere coincidences. There was something behind it all. Something deep, and Tom was caught right in the middle of it. But he didn't know what it was. Not yet. The officer from earlier had left him with more questions than answers. Military yacht, he had said, his voice barely above a whisper. And now, the team was insisting he come with them for questioning. Tom had declined, and rightfully so. He had been through enough interrogations in his life to know when something wasn't right. No one had explained why a military yacht was even in those waters, why it was involved in the crash, or why they had set up a complete blockade. And why hadn't they told him about the cargo? There was something on that yacht, something they were after. But no one had told him what it was. So Tom waited. He didn't go to the diner, where most of the other locals gathered. He didn't want to hear more rumors or half-baked theories. He couldn't trust anyone right now, not until he figured out exactly what was going on. He stayed near the water, observing the ships, watching for any hint, any sign that could give him answers. Hours passed, and the fog began to roll back in. The harbor, once lively with the sounds of tourists and fishermen, now felt like a ghost town. The only noise was the occasional screech of seagulls, the rustling of the wind through the buildings, and the soft crashing of waves against the pier. Tom felt the weight of isolation pressing down on him. Then, a car pulled into the parking lot. Tom's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just any car. He recognized the model, a dark, sleek SUV. The type used by government personnel, the kind that didn't stop for anyone. His eyes narrowed, his instincts kicking in. Without thinking, he walked towards the lot, keeping low, staying out of sight. He wasn't sure why he had this feeling, but something told him that the answers he needed were on that SUV. The door of the car opened, and out stepped a woman. She was tall, dressed in a dark jacket, and her face was hidden beneath a pair of large sunglasses. Tom watched her from behind the corner of a nearby building. She looked around briefly, as though scanning the area, before walking toward the nearest building. She wasn't acting like a civilian. She moved with purpose. Tom followed her quietly, staying at a distance, never letting her see him. She went inside a nondescript building near the harbor, one that Tom knew was used for storage and maintenance. But there was no reason for anyone from the Navy to be inside that building. The door swung shut behind her, and Tom hesitated for a moment. His curiosity gnawed at him. He couldn't let this go. He had to know what was inside. Slowly, he crept toward the door, staying low to the ground. The door wasn't locked. He pushed it open just enough to slip inside. What he saw next shocked him to his core. There, in the dimly lit room, stood the woman, talking to a man in a Navy uniform. But it wasn't just any man. Tom knew him. He had seen him before, the officer who had approached him earlier, the one who had seemed so nervous, so hesitant. They were arguing. Tom couldn't make out the words, but their voices were rising. The woman pointed toward the map on the wall, a map of the entire coastline, and the officer seemed to get more and more agitated with each passing second. Tom stepped closer, careful not to make a sound. "I don't care about the yacht," the woman said, her voice sharp. "I care about what's inside that damn container." Tom froze. "Container? What container?" The officer swallowed hard, his face turning pale. "You don't understand," he said in a low voice. "It's not that simple. You can't just stop. You'll do it, or you won't. There's no room for negotiation here." There was a brief silence before the woman spoke again. "We need to get it off the ship. Before anyone finds out. If we don't, we're both screwed." Tom's heart pounded. Whatever they were talking about, it wasn't just a simple investigation. It wasn't just a crashed yacht. They were after something big. And it was on that yacht. Something that could change everything. The officer nodded, his face pale. "I'll make the call. But we need more time." The woman turned toward the door, and Tom quickly backed away, his breath catching in his chest. He wasn't sure what he had just overheard, but one thing was clear: this wasn't just about a wreck anymore. This was about something far more dangerous. He had to find out what it was. The next day, the sun rose without the usual vibrancy. The coastal town felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But Tom couldn't wait any longer. He needed to act. He knew the Navy wouldn't tell him anything. They couldn't. Whatever they were hiding, it was bigger than him, bigger than the harbor, bigger than the wreck. But Tom wasn't backing down. He had spent years fighting for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against him. He wasn't going to let this mystery slip through his fingers. He made his way back to the storage building, knowing it would be a risk. The woman and the officer were still there, and Tom was determined to get answers. He didn't care how dangerous it was. He had to know. As he approached the building, he saw a truck pull up. It wasn't a government vehicle, but it wasn't an ordinary truck either. The man who got out was dressed in a black suit, his face expressionless. Tom's instincts screamed at him to stay back. But it was too late. The man looked directly at him, locking eyes for a moment. Tom's heart skipped. He couldn't back down now. The mystery was too close. Tom's heart raced as he stood frozen, staring at the man who had just stepped out of the black-suited vehicle. His instincts screamed at him to run, to turn around and disappear into the shadows. But something deep inside, told him he was too close now to back down. The mystery was no longer just a story of a yacht crash, or even of a strange military presence in his harbor. It was something bigger. Something that could change the entire course of his life. The man in the black suit didn't move. He stood tall, his eyes locked onto Tom with a cold intensity that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. There was no hesitation in his stare, only the kind of unflinching certainty that came with authority, an authority Tom didn't understand but couldn't ignore. "You're far from home," the man said, his voice calm, almost too calm, like a predator toying with its prey. Tom's throat tightened. He knew that voice. He'd heard it before, in dark alleyways and quiet rooms, the kind of voice that demanded you listen or suffer the consequences. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "Who are you?" The man stepped closer, his black shoes clicking against the pavement. "It doesn't matter who I am," he replied, his eyes scanning the harbor behind Tom. "What matters is what you know." Tom wasn't sure what he meant, but the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The man's gaze moved past him, and Tom felt an unsettling sense of being cornered. The man had no intention of letting him go. "Don't play games with me," Tom said, his voice firmer than he felt. "I know something's going on here." "What are you hiding?" The man gave a short, humorless laugh. "Hiding? What makes you think that?" His smile was cold, empty, like it didn't reach his eyes. "You don't know what's happening here. You don't know what's at stake." Tom's mind raced. He had to think quickly. He needed to find a way to get answers, to get to the heart of what was going on before it was too late. He couldn't back down now. He had to push, to dig deeper. "You're with them, aren't you?" Tom pressed, trying to gauge the man's reaction. "The people behind the yacht and the Navy, what's the real reason you're here? What's in that container?" The man's smile faltered for just a second, and that was enough. Tom saw it, saw the crack in the facade. Whatever it was, the man was hiding something, and Tom was on the verge of discovering it. "I suggest you step back," the man said, his tone growing more serious. "You don't want to be involved in this. Trust me." But Tom wasn't going to step back. He couldn't. Not after everything he had seen, everything he had heard. He was already too far in. And the more the man tried to push him away, the more Tom knew there was something huge at stake. Tom took a step forward, his voice low but determined. "I won't stop until I get answers." The man's face twisted, his lips pulling into a thin, dangerous line. "Fine," he said, almost casually, as if he had already made up his mind. "You want answers? You'll get them. But understand this. What you're dealing with is far more dangerous than you think. The truth, Tom, will change everything." With that, the man turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Tom standing there, his pulse racing in his ears. What had he just agreed to? What truth was the man talking about? And more importantly, why did it feel like the walls were closing in? Tom knew he couldn't let it go. Not now. He couldn't stand by and let this mystery slip away without getting to the bottom of it. His gut was telling him there was more to this than he could have ever imagined. And with every step he took, the feeling of being drawn into something much bigger, much darker, only intensified. Later that afternoon, Tom made his way back to the storage building. He knew the woman and the officer were still inside, but now he had a new plan. He couldn't just watch from the shadows anymore. He had to get inside, had to find out what was really going on. The building was quieter than before. Tom peeked around the corner, noticing the familiar black SUV parked near the entrance. He didn't hesitate this time. He walked straight toward the door, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. There were no guards, no security. It was almost too easy. The door creaked open as Tom slipped inside, staying as quiet as possible. His heart was hammering in his chest, but he couldn't afford to second-guess himself. This was it. The answers he had been searching for were just within reach. Inside, the room was dark, the only light coming from a single hanging bulb that cast long shadows along the walls. The woman and the officer were standing near the map, their conversation muffled, but Tom could hear the urgency in their voices. He moved closer, his footsteps barely making a sound on the concrete floor. "You're sure it's here?" the woman was asking, her voice sharp and impatient. The officer nodded, looking nervously at the floor. "It's all on the manifest. The container's locked down tight, but the coordinates are clear. The Navy's been trying to track it for days." Tom's heart skipped. The container. The one that had been on the yacht. The one they were so desperate to get off the ship. He had to know what was inside. "Why is it so important?" Tom blurted out, stepping out from the shadows. The woman froze, her eyes flashing with surprise, then narrowing with suspicion. "Who the hell are you?" Tom didn't back down. "I know what you're after. I heard you talking. I want to know what's in that container." The officer looked like he was about to say something, but the woman cut him off with a sharp gesture. "You really want to know?" she said, her voice cold. "Fine. But you'll regret it." She walked over to a cabinet and pulled out a set of keys, her movements deliberate. "You think this is just about a yacht wreck?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "This is about something far bigger. That container holds something that could change the world. And if you think you can just walk away from it, well, you're wrong." Tom's mind raced. What could be so important that they were willing to go to these lengths to protect it? The woman unlocked a small chest behind the cabinet, pulling out a folder. She tossed it onto the table in front of him. "That's what's in the container. That's what we've been tracking." Tom opened the folder, his hands trembling. The first page was a map, an intricate, detailed map of the coastline, the exact coordinates marked in several places. But the second page made his blood run cold. It was a series of documents, some in English, others in a language he didn't recognize. But one thing was clear: these weren't ordinary cargo manifests. These were blueprints, detailed plans for something enormous. "This is just the beginning," the woman said, her voice eerily calm. "What's in that container is a weapon. Not just any weapon, a weapon that can change the balance of power in the world." Tom couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was no ordinary government operation. This was a global-scale conspiracy, and he had stumbled right into its heart. The yacht crash, the Navy ships, the sudden secrecy, it was all connected. "What now?" Tom asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Now," the woman replied, "you walk away. Or you become part of this. Your choice." But Tom knew there was no walking away from this. Not now. He had already stepped too far into the web.